The bottom of a 17th century warship was covered in thousands of sharp, calcium carbonate barnacles, and keelhauling involved dragging a bound sailor directly across them. The ship that carried the crew across the ocean was turned into a massive, floating meat grater. A wooden vessel spending months at sea didn't stay smooth. The wood beneath the waterline became entirely encrusted with marine life. Specifically, the hull was heavily colonized by acorn barnacles. A barnacle is a small crustacean that builds a cone-shaped shell out of overlapping calcium carbonate plates. They cement their backs to the wooden planks using natural adhesives that harden like concrete. A single square meter of a ship's hull could hold up to 72,000 of these individual shells. On top of each shell sit smaller, movable plates called the operculum. These structures feature rigid, irregular ridges with edges sharp enough to slice open human skin on contact. Sailors knew exactly how sharp these shells were because they regularly spent weeks in dry dock, scraping them off the hull to reduce water drag. Over a long voyage, the entire bottom of the ship transformed into a jagged, artificial reef. The punishment of keelhauling utilized this dense field of organic razor blades. Naval discipline operated on a simple and brutal principle. A sailor was trapped in the middle of the ocean with nowhere to run. A standard voyage lasted for months, with crews living in damp quarters and eating salted meat. Men died of scurvy, and mutiny was a constant threat. Captains needed a way to demonstrate absolute authority over desperate men. Other execution methods required an executioner, a specialized device, or a wooden scaffold. Keelhauling required nothing but the ship's standard rigging. Executing this required the crew to repurpose the heavy yardarms. The sailor was stripped of their clothing to expose maximum bearskin to the hull. Then, a long, thick hemp rope was rigged through the wooden blocks and pulleys attached to the heavy horizontal spars that supported the ship's massive square sails. The rope was passed entirely underneath the ship, dropping into the water on the port side and pulled up on the starboard side. The crew bound the victims' wrists securely to one end of the wet line. They usually strapped heavy weights made of solid lead or iron to the sailors' legs. This added ballast was necessary because the human body naturally floats, and the goal was to sink the victim deep enough to scrape against the lowest and widest point of the ship's curved belly. Sometimes, the crew stuffed a sponge or an oil-soaked rag into the victim's mouth to prevent them from swallowing too much water, though this often just caused them to choke faster. When the captain gave the final order, the crew hoisted the condemned man up to the end of the yardarm, dangling him 30 feet above the water. Then they simply let go. The victim fell suddenly into the sea, plunging deep beneath the surface as the iron weights dragged him downward. On the opposite deck, a designated team of sailors gripped the other end of the rope. They began hauling the line, pulling the submerged man directly toward the ship's bottom. As the thick rope drew tight, the geometry of the curved hull forced the victim flush against the wood. The water pressure at a depth of 15 feet pinned them to the ship. A standard galleon or warship was incredibly wide. The man was dragged blindly across 40 feet of sharp calcium carbonate. The friction stripped away skin, tore through muscle tissue, severed ears, and exposed bare bone. The victim was eventually hauled up out of the water on the opposite side of the ship, gasping for air, choking on seawater, and bleeding profusely from hundreds of parallel lacerations. Side-to-side keelhauling was considered the lesser version of the punishment. A much more lethal variation involved dragging the victim from the bow of the ship to the stern. The crew ran the rope straight down the length of the vessel's centerline. A 17th century Dutch warship measured well over 130 feet long. Hauling a man across the entire length of the keel meant extended, unbroken contact with the barnacle colonies. There wasn't any escaping the friction, and there wasn't any escaping the water. The victim was pulled through the dark ocean, while the ship's heavy wooden spine continuously shredded their body. In a side-to-side pass, a long enough rope might give the victim a desperate half-second to grab a breath of air on the far side before being yanked back under. In a boat-to-stern pass, the victim stayed submerged for the entire length of the ship. This process created a grim pacing problem for the officers in charge. The crew pulling the ropes on the deck had to calibrate their hauling speed perfectly. It took intense physical exertion from 10 to 15 men hauling on a heavy, wet hemp rope to pull a fully grown man through the water resistance. If they pulled too slowly, the victim remained underwater for too long and simply drowned before the barnacles could inflict the intended amount of physical damage. Holding your breath while resting in a chair is one thing, but holding it while being flayed alive underwater is biologically impossible. The intense shock and pain caused an involuntary gasp reflex, filling the victim's lungs with cold seawater. But if the crew pulled the heavy rope too quickly, the victim passed over the hull with less friction. They survived with fewer lacerations, frustrating the purpose of the sentence. In cases where the victim survived a fast pull with only minor injuries, the captain simply ordered them to be keel-hauled a second or even third time until the physical damage was deemed sufficient. Another massive risk during the drag was blunt force head trauma. If the ship was anchored in choppy waters, or if it was actively moving under sail, the hull heaved up and down in the heavy waves. The victim, suspended on the rope beneath the ship, easily smashed their skull against the solid oak timbers. A single hard impact against the wood knocked the sailor unconscious, guaranteeing they drown before the crew finished hauling the rope. It wasn't just rogue pirate violence. Keelhauling was an institutional, highly regulated practice with deep historical roots. The earliest mention of dragging a sailor under a ship appears in the Byzantine Rhodian Maritime Code around the year 700. But it was the Dutch Navy that formally codified the punishment in an official naval ordinance dating back to 1560. European navies actively used it from the 15th through the 18th century as a deterrent against mutiny, murder, and desertion. Ship captains carefully logged the occurrences in their official records. On October 11, 1652, a sailor named Jan Blank was punished under the command of Jan van Riebeek. For the crime of deserting his post at the Dutch East India Company for 9 days, Blank was whipped 150 times and then keel-hauled. He survived the ordeal, but the captain subsequently enslaved him for 2 years as a continuation of his sentence. The exact mechanics of the punishment were permanently captured by the Dutch Golden Age painter Leef Pieter Schuurster. Sometime between 1660 and 1686, he produced a massive oil painting depicting the keel-hauling of a ship surgeon who served under Admiral Jan van Ness. The painting, which now hangs in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, measures roughly 106 by 159 centimeters. It shows a grand Dutch warship anchored in a bright, sunny harbor. A huge crowd of sailors in smaller boats surrounds the main vessel, gathered specifically to watch the execution. High up on the ship's rigging, you can see the thick ropes strung through the wooden pulleys. Below the yardarm, the condemned man is shown suspended in midair just above the water, bound and ready to be dropped. An official in a bright orange cloak watches from the deck, ensuring the procedure is carried out according to the strict naval code. The event was staged as a public spectacle, designed to send a terrible warning to every mariner in the fleet. For those who actually survived the long drag beneath the ship, the ordeal was only half over. The barnacles acted as dirty, organic blades, slicing deep into the victim's flesh. As the man was pulled up from the depths, his fresh wounds were immediately flooded with raw ocean saltwater. The salt burned the exposed nerves and packed marine bacteria directly into the torn muscle tissue. Medical care on a 17th century ship consisted mostly of dirty rags, crude salves, and amputations. The ship's doctor attempted to bandage the shredded skin, but they didn't have antibiotics. Survivors faced weeks of agonizing, rotting infections as their bodies tried to heal from the massive surface trauma. Many men who survived the drowning and the scraping ultimately died of sepsis in the dark, damp belly of the ship a few days later. If a man managed to survive the drag, the saltwater, and the subsequent infection, his entire body was left covered in thick, raised keloid scars. He became a permanent, walking billboard for naval obedience. The Dutch Navy didn't officially abolish the practice until 1853. For hundreds of years, it stood as the ultimate naval deterrent. No special execution device was built. No complex mechanical scaffold was designed. The ship that carried the crew across the ocean was also the exact thing that destroyed them.